In this video, we will take a look at a transform tool known as the crosstab tool. The crosstab tool allows us to create one new column for each new categorical value held in a single existing column. It essentially pivots the data from a vertical layout to a horizontal layout, having the inverse effect of what we saw with the transpose tool. In fact, we covered the transpose tool, which turned our tables from a wide dataset to a long dataset, so it turns many columns into one column. Now you can think of the crosstab tool as being a way of being able to take a long dataset and transforming it to a wide dataset, or turning one column into many columns. So it has the opposite effect. So let's dive straight into some examples to understand how it operates. Seeing as we've covered the transpose tool, I actually want to leverage on this understanding to illustrate the crosstab functionality. So firstly, let's drag in an input tool onto the canvas and connect to our dataset called game, which we saw when walking through the summarize tool. Now the first thing we're going to do is transpose this data so we end up with team, players, and round as key columns. And then we should have one column stating the question number, i.e. the headers from the data columns, and we should then have another column which states the scores, so either a 1 or a 0. When we run this workflow, our wide formatted dataset is transformed into a long formatted dataset. What we will do now is connect a crosstab to the output of the transpose tool and try to revert us back to the original dataset, i.e. turn our long dataset back into a wide dataset. This should make it easier to conceptualize what's happening. So in the configuration window of the crosstab tool, we need to set a few options. Firstly, at the top, we have a section labeled Group Data by these values. This will, in a very similar way to any group by function, group the values in the columns you select together so that there is one row per unique observation. So we'll be making a similar selection to the key columns in the transpose tool, but the result set will show a unique row of observations when looking across all three columns. So I need to select team, players, and round in this example. Next, we have a configuration option called Change Column Headers. What this will do is create a new column for each unique value contained within the column that you select from this dropdown. So if we select name in this example, which we know represents the question number in our dataset, we would expect to see columns for question 1, question 2, Q3, and so on. The third configuration option is called Values for New Columns. So far, we've decided what to group by and have decided on what column values to take as our headers. But we now need to stipulate the column that will act as the values. So in this example, we know we want to see 1s or 0s underneath each question column. So we will select the value for the new columns to be the value column from our transpose dataset. Finally, depending on the level of aggregation you've selected in your group by option at the very top, you need to stipulate the method for aggregating values. In this example, seeing as we are trying to get back to our original dataset by pivoting our long format back into a wide format, we just want to sum the values accordingly and place the result in the respective columns. So this should do us for this example. Let's run the workflow and observe the result. As you can see, when we click on the output of the input data, we have a wide format. When we move across and look at the output of the transpose tool, our data has been transformed into a long format. And finally, if we check the output of the crosstab tool, we have pivoted our data back to the same format as the original dataset. We have a slightly different ordering, but if we scroll down and take a look at round 1 for Mike, we can see that he scored 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1 for round 1. And if we compare this to the raw input, we can see that it states the same. So the reason I'm sharing this is so that conceptually, you can think of the crosstab tool as being the opposite of the transpose tool. You can take a long formatted dataset and set it to a wide formatted dataset. I now want to walk through one more example, which is a little different on a different dataset that covers the concept through a slightly different lens. So we are first going to connect to our tutorial data. And the first thing we're going to do is clean up our gender column so that the special characters are removed from either the male or female valid values. So we can drag in a formula tool and we're going to select gender from the output column as this is what we want to address. We then want to type replace as we're going to use the replace function. And then we are going to look in the gender column. We're going to look up this sequence of string characters and this will be replaced with an empty string. Okay, so with the gender column cleaned up, what we want to try to achieve is the following. We want to see a final output that shows us each user ID, first name and last name in 3 columns. We then want a column representing each gender, and then within each gender column, we want to see the email address of each user. Pause the video and see if you can construct the workflow to get the desired result. Okay, so seeing as we want user ID, first name and last name as our first 3 columns, we are going to select them from the group data by these values configuration option list. Next, we want to select the field that contains the column headers for our new dataset. I'm hoping the data cleansing of the gender field was a big clue, so here we want to select gender. Therefore, we should end up with a final result that has a column labelled female and a column labelled male. Within these columns, we want the values for the new columns to be email. So we're going to select email from this drop-down list. Now in the method for aggregating values, we have 3 options, unlike the previous example. This is because we've decided to include a string value as the value to incorporate for the new columns. Now we can do a couple of things. In the event that there are multiple possible values, which all depends on the initial grouping selection, we can either concatenate the strings together, we can pick the first string value, or we can pick the last string value. Now seeing as we are grouping by user ID, which is the most granular level with a unique record for each row, each of these selections will produce the same result. So we'll leave it as concatenate for the time being, as I'll show an example shortly when this selection matters. When we run the workflow, you can see that for each user ID, we can see their name and also a column for female and male with emails in each one, just like we wanted. Now I know in this dataset that there are multiple people with the name Josh. So let's only group by first name to see how the concatenate option works. At the bottom here, I can add separators when concatenating. So I'll add a comma and then a space by providing the escape syntax / and then an S. When I rerun the workflow, you can see that for the name Josh, 3 emails were found, and they've been concatenated and have been separated by a comma and a space. Now you don't just have to use a comma and a space. If you wanted a tab, you could use /T, and if you wanted the values to appear on different lines, you could use \n. The separator you use is up to you. So hopefully that was useful in seeing how the crosstab tool works. Just picture it as having the opposite effect compared to the transpose tool. Make sure you practice turning long formatted datasets into wide formatted datasets to make sure you have this skill in your toolbox. You never know when a use case for it will come up and you'll be ready to utilize the crosstab tool.